I'd just like to take a moment to welcome you all to Melbourne, the world's most livable city. And I'd like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people who are the traditional custodians of this land. And I would also like to pay my respect to their elders, both past and present, of the Kulin Nation, and extend that respect to other Indigenous Australians that may be present. So the Economist Intelligence Unit has named Melbourne the most livable city for the past 7 years. This is a source of pride for the local population and politicians alike. It is usually a lead story in the local media and is often a topic of conversation around the barbecue when there are interstate or international guests in our midst. However, I suspect if I spoke with the visitors in the audience today, I would find plenty of people willing to argue about the quality standard of living in their own capital cities. The ranking is intended as a tool for companies to determine the premium they may need to pay employees who have been relocated to that particular city. From this point of view, there is some bias in the survey, as it's taken from the point of view of a person with reasonable means to pay for products and services. Within Melbourne, residents often point to the affordability of quality housing and question whether we truly are the most livable city. Availability of good quality housing is only one of the 30 indicators used in the rating tool, but is of considerable importance to local residents. Today, I would like to take a look at what we can do to create quality housing within tall buildings from a structural engineer's point of view. I'll draw on my own personal experiences and those of my colleagues at WSP to outline a tall building that considers long-term community benefits of sustainability and adaptability in the design decisions. This picture of the skyline of the city reflects a bit of our recent growth and shows some of our opportunities. Central to the picture is Southern Cross Station. And to the west of Southern Cross Station, there's the numerous offices that have been built up in the Docklands area recently. To the east of the station is the heart of the city, which has traditionally been dominated by commercial buildings, but is slowly starting to see the rise of residential towers. At this end of the city, there have been several recent developments, the most prominent of which is the Upper West Side development, where there's 5 towers housing over 3,000 apartments. But also visible in this is 568 Collins and Prima Pearl on the other side, which account for another 1,200 apartments. And the precinct around Prima Pearl includes several 30 to 40-storey residential towers along City Road and the south bank of the Yarra. Under construction within this photo alone is the first 2 of 4 towers at Westside Place, which will eventually house another 2,600 apartments. Premier Tower with 660 apartments is also under construction, as is the Melbourne Quarter with mixed-use office and another 1,600 apartments. There are opportunities still to demolish older buildings within the city centre to create more sites, and in the new development area of Fisherman's Bend to the southwest of the city, and through further infill projects in areas around our transport infrastructure. Southern Cross Station, you can see, already has commercial developments built over the side, to the west of it and to the south of it, but there is still opportunities to the north. This snapshot reflects the opportunities available throughout the broader city. What must be kept in mind is that the buildings we construct today are likely to be here for the next 50 to 100 years. This is the reason the quality of the buildings and the ability for them to be adapted to suit future needs is important. So as the world's most livable city, what challenges does Melbourne face? The following is a list of challenges faced by most cities around the world. Melbourne has a growing population. It recently has experienced rapid growth. Since 2006, Greater Melbourne has grown from 3.7 million residents to 4.7 by 2016. And we're projected to shortly reach 5 million and to hit 6 million by 2031. The City of Melbourne has grown from 76,000 in 2006 to 136,000 residents in 2016, with there expected to be another 100,000 residents by 2031. Current projections show that the city will need another 70,000 dwellings by 2031. These can be expected to be predominantly in high-rise buildings, but based on our current arrangement of 10 to 15 apartments per floor, it would require in the order of 100 60-storey apartment towers. As the population grows, it creates pressures on the capacity of existing infrastructure. Traditionally, Melbourne has increased the housing stock by expanding the urban boundary. This has created a ring of outer suburbs that are poorly serviced by public transport. The lack of adequate public transport leads to an over-reliance on cars in the areas, which cause congestion on the road networks. This kind of urban sprawl leads to a density of housing that cannot necessarily justify the level of public transport provided in more dense cities. So increasing density of housing in established areas can require upgrades to existing services such as power, water, sewer and internet. However, these upgrades are often more efficient than placing new services in the urban fringe. Another pressure within Melbourne is the increasing house price. Melbourne's median house price has grown $100,000 or 13.9% over the past year alone and is now sitting at $880,000. While apartments are more affordable with a median price of $500,000, they have also risen more than 11% over the past year. Over the past 20 years, Melbourne has averaged an annual 7% increase in the median price, which rises to a 9% annual increase over just the past 5 years. A measure of housing affordability is a household income to house price ratio, and this has increased from 3.5 to 7.5 over the past 20 years. Now that's a whole heap of numbers, and maybe it doesn't paint a true picture of the affordability of the housing. But the regular media coverage, the political interest, and the anecdotal stories we'll all hear from our colleagues and friends tells us that it is a real issue that our population faces. So housing construction on the fringes of the city generally meet the requirements for a broader range of the population, but suffer from the lack of accessibility to infrastructure and services. Whereas the majority of new housing stock in the inner city is suited to singles and couples without children. There is a lack of appropriate quality housing for families in the new inner city developments. While there's often been planning allowances for schools in the new suburbs on the fringes of the city, there have not been similar allowances made for the current growth of inner city housing. Although the inner city accommodation is generally expected to suit households with children, but without children, the demographic data for the City of Melbourne shows that 15% of households have children. The Victorian Government has recognised this need and is planning new schools in inner Melbourne. Finally, maintaining green spaces. Melbourne has 12 designated green wedges around the perimeter of its urban growth boundaries. There are restrictions in place on this land such that only a mix of agricultural and low-density activities are permitted. 1/3 of the area is devoted to public parks and water catchment areas. Expansion on the fringes of Melbourne put pressures on these green wedges and the acceptable uses. So how can a tall building help? Tall buildings are not always seen as contributing to creating a livable city. However, one that is properly planned and designed with the benefit to the community in mind can help Melbourne maintain its reputation as a livable city. I will look in more detail at how a tall building can help by increasing the density of housing, how we can be more selective with the sites we use, mixed-use construction within these buildings, sustainable and adaptable construction. So what's a structural engineer going to do about this? So throughout the design process, we provide advice to our clients and the rest of the design team about what are the most structurally efficient choices to make. We generally base our recommendations on our past experiences and then confirm them with analysis. This bias can sometimes mean that we overlooked alternatives that can have a greater overall benefit to the community. Most of our decisions are based on considering the short-term costs in terms of the cost of materials and the cost of construction. To be fair, these are also the main concerns of our clients, and so we're generally acting in their best interests. It is likely that clients may need external motivations to encourage them to consider long-term community benefits, and I'll touch on that at the end of the presentation. So one of the most obvious benefits of high-rise residential towers is the ability to increase the density of housing. A 70-storey tower can deliver 600 apartments on a lot size that may only contain 2 dwellings in suburban Melbourne. This more efficient use of space should help to increase affordability by providing alternative options for people to work close to their place of employment or study. The effect of increased density is a two-sided coin for infrastructure and community services. Having increasing density concentrates the requirement for such public infrastructure, allowing it to be delivered more efficiently than in areas of urban sprawl. However, it's important to keep in mind a dramatic increase in housing density in a particular location can lead to problems with there being adequate services for the residents. It is therefore important that the government works with developers to provide upgrades to existing infrastructure and services when required. Two of the key challenges for new apartment buildings is to provide quality housing that suits different sections of the demographic and to help to develop a sense of community among the residents. From my own experience living in apartments and from speaking with friends, it is difficult to get to know your neighbours in many apartment buildings where the majority of the share space is the public corridor with a whole heap of closed doors. This increased density, particularly if it is done in a sustainable manner, can provide a solution for accommodating the growing population of Melbourne without creating further urban sprawl. There needs to be due consideration given to where it is most appropriate to locate a new high-rise building. Planning provisions generally restrict tall buildings to the City of Melbourne, with the majority in the Central City, Docklands, South Bank, and moving forward in the Fisherman's Bend area of Port Melbourne. However, within the Central City, suitable sites are limited due to existing and adjacent buildings. The yield that is possible from a tall building can help to make feasible more difficult sites. One potential is to build over existing rail yards within the Central City. This delivers a better outcome for the community as it better utilises existing space, helps to better connect the city and conceals a potential eyesore. For the building being presented today, it is proposed that it could be located on a site in the southeast corner of the CBD over rail lines and Wellington Parade. Beneath the ground in this area are 2 of the tunnels for the city loop that Richard was talking about earlier. Wellington Parade is not a critical part of the road network, so it could be temporarily closed during construction and reconfigured to suit the new buildings. The size of the site provides several options for locating tall buildings, with opportunity to provide adequate support structures for such buildings. One of the reasons I looked at this site was the Federation Square was a built-over rail project that happened here. And there's already a lot of plans for what they're terming Federation East, which is the next chunk of land over the railway. So I probably will call this Federation Square Far East. But looking at the options here, we've got the park to the north and Birrong Ma Park to the south. So there's an opportunity to create a connecting corridor between those 2 green spaces. The northern part of the site I've outlined is not heavily covered with rail, so there's a lot of opportunities to get decent structure through there to help support a high-rise building. It's also much further set back from the Yarra than the main Federation Square site. It's much closer to where the high-rise buildings already are in the city centre. So in terms of a site location, it is ideal. So this site provides many opportunities for future residents due to its prime CBD location. It has close proximity to public transport, places of employment, and easy access to major universities and hospitals. It is close to both the established Fitzroy Gardens and the new Birrong Ma Park, as I pointed out. The key challenges will be constructing over the existing rail yards and City Loop train tunnels. However, this is something that has already been done at the nearby Federation Square and at Media House near Southern Cross Station. With a tall building on the site, careful planning would need to be made to provide load paths for the main columns and cores onto crash walls and similar supporting structures between the rail lines. It's common to consider mixed-use construction with high-rise buildings. Most recent apartment buildings in Melbourne have limited retail space in their lower floors, with the podium generally filled with car parking and additional apartments. A tall building that is trying to deliver better community outcomes could utilise the podium to deliver services for the community, such as health or education facilities. In addition, there's an opportunity to provide public facilities at both the top of the podium and the top of the building. Providing a green roof on the podium tied to internal community spaces and a facility such as a library at the top of the building would help to create a better sense of community within the building. These spaces could be utilised by students if there is a vertical school also located within the podium. The full deck across the rail yards would provide additional ground level space for retail spaces, parks and other community recreational spaces. Those of you who were at the earlier part of the conference this week would have heard quite a few descriptions about buildings in London and Sydney having much more community space located within the height of the building. It's something that is generally lacking around Melbourne, and it's something that we probably really need to consider if we're trying to deliver a better community outcome with our buildings. Right, so finally we get to something that's a little bit closer to my heart, the structure. So this is just an indicative apartment layout of an efficient structure. We've probably done 10, 12 buildings similar to this. It's got a central core, it's got mega columns to the perimeter and shear walls tying the whole thing together. It's an efficient structure. The apartments are too deep. You could get 10 or 12 apartments per floor. And you've got a central corridor accessing all those apartments. I'm sure a lot of architects in the room may be cringing at my sketch, and they would have a lot more impact on how that building would eventually look. So with a building of this size, approximately 20 metres wide, we generally have a podium, which may be 40 metres high, and on top we could probably put 200 odd metres of apartments in this format with a slenderness ratio of around 1 to 10, 1 to 11. And that would be a feasible structural design. So the Better Apartments Design Standard was released by the Victorian State Government late last year. It discusses a number of principles for delivering, as the title suggests, a better standard of apartment. Planning application for new apartment buildings are judged against this criteria. The diagram above is illustrating a requirement for 40% of apartments to have effective cross ventilation. On this basis, if our structurally efficient layout I showed previously had only 10 apartments, with the four corners having cross ventilation, this criteria would be met. But what about the other 60% of the apartments in the building, which are left with no natural ventilation and also a reduced amount of natural light? By working with an efficient structural layout, we are left with an inefficient, single-sided apartments with a reliance on artificial light and ventilation. So this proposed layout delivers a more efficient outcome with regard to natural light and ventilation. With only a single row of apartments and a corridor on the external facade, it's possible to have sufficient natural light and effective cross-ventilation to all the apartments. The cores at each end of the apartment are only 10 metres in width, which means for an equivalent slenderness ratio to the previous tower we showed, we could only probably have 110 metres above the podium, perhaps a 35-storey tower. So how do we improve the stiffness of a very slender tower? We can put a group of them together. So as an indicative layout, if we put 3 of them in a triangular type formation, and we could tie them together with bracing up to a certain height, and basically engage the 2 chords. So this layout would deliver both the efficiency and also generate, still maintain that natural light and ventilation to the apartments. The one major obstacle with this new layout is economic viability. So I'm now getting a much lesser yield out of a similar size site. So what does the apartment layout look like in this hypothetical building that we're talking about? So I've shown as a typical 2-bed apartment. You can get windows on both sides of the apartment to get that cross flow. On the corridor side, for fire requirements, you'd need to set the windows up so it's at least 1.5 metres off the corridor floor. You could have operable louvers to the corridor, which could be controlled by a building maintenance system that helps to maintain a constant temperature within the corridor, and then leave it up to the apartment owners whether they choose to open their windows and allow cross ventilation through their apartments. So by working with a modular layout, with a spacing of about 7.2 metres for the columns, we can also fit 1-bed, 2-bed and 3-bed apartments within the same grid. This allows a modular layout that means you can, at a future stage, if you choose, rearrange the layout of the building and to better suit a changing demographic. So basically it gives you an opportunity to deliver something which is what some people term the cradle to a grave solution. So you can be growing up in one of these apartments, you might downsize through your 20s and 30s and then upsize again once you're a family. And perhaps you don't want to spend your entire life living in one building, but it's the concept that you can have that mixed demographic located in one building. So I didn't only want to consider the structure of the form of the building, I want to also consider the materiality. So what I think would be a better sustainable solution would be to use a CLT solution. However, I don't want to just throw out all the structural efficiencies that I'm used to in a concrete building. So I would propose that we'd go with a concrete core and precast columns, and then utilise timber CLT beams and floor plates. This will help deliver a more carbon neutral building, yet does not have the restrictions of oversized CLT columns. So I've already spoken about the adaptable layouts and I am running out of time. So I would like to finish up just talking briefly about the financial considerations. So one of the recurring challenges with this proposed tower was economic viability. Unfortunately, the long-term community benefits of providing a more sustainable building design does not normally figure into the financial calculations of developers. Some of you in Sydney may have heard Derry Yu from New World China Land quoting a 50 to 80 year return period for the return on investment of some of the super tall towers they are developing. Most residential developers have a much shorter term outlook. In my opinion, it falls to the government to determine how important these sustainable measures are in terms of community benefit. They have the opportunity to then regulate for developers to include them or make the investment themselves through a public-private partnership. At the start of the talk, we identified affordable housing as one of the threats to Melbourne's status as the world's most livable city. While the proposed tower delivers a better quality apartment, it is likely to be at a much higher price point, even if it is economically viable. To truly address the issue of affordability, it would also require intervention from the government. It could be part of the conditions placed on the consortium given the rights to develop the entire site. Exploration of these options is outside the scope of this talk, and it's clear that further work is required. What I'd like to leave you with is that there is more that structural engineers can do to help deliver a better housing with long-term community benefits. We can start by not jumping to the most obvious efficient structural solution and look outside of the box. Thank you.